Why is surrendering to physiological sensations safe? Because it doesn't come from the head. It doesn't come from the cerebral idea about who my character is. It comes from my intuition, from my instinct, from my subconscious. It comes from reliable source. Because your head can do construction of character, plotting, conceptual thing. It can be influenced by what I know about the character from actors who played it before, what kind of dogmatic idea I may have formed in my head. That's what the head is capable of doing, of misjudging. But what's coming from me that is physiological, it's safe to trust it because it's coming from the body, from the psyche, from your whole being. So it's one of the most reliable aspects of character facilitation and character development because it's non-cerebral and it cannot lead you into the intellectual realm. It always comes from the mighty subconscious.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unlocking Creativity Conversations in the Demidov School. My name is Nolan Hennelly, and I'm a certified teacher at the Demidov School, an actor and voiceover artist based in New York City. And with me is Kimon, another certified teacher in the Demidov School based in Athens. And we're lucky enough to have with us also today DeAnna Wright, who is currently a student in the Demidov Association in the second year, but has a long-standing history of Demidov work as a teacher and as a student, both. And then, of course, Andrei Malaev-Babel, the head and certifying master teacher of the Demidov program. And this week, we are going to be talking about the culture of physiological truth. So, let's get to it. What does that mean, Andrei? That's what I want to start with, because when I was in undergraduate, acting programs, I never heard the term physiological, right? That was not a thing that came up in all of my acting training. And so when I got into the Demidov world, that word started coming up and started to have a much more profound meaning. But I thought that we would just kind of start with defining physiological truth for people that may be coming to this from some other sort of, acting training and haven't, like me, heard the term before. So please, Andrei.
Nolan, thank you for acknowledging it because it doesn't really exist in any other training and in any other school, only in Demidov. Demidov is the only one who is talking physiology. And it sounds like nitty-gritty. It sounds like it's base. It sounds like it's rough. It sounds like, what does it have to do with art? And yet, what we witnessed again and again and again in our training is that physiological truth, when it's not neglected, when it's actually honored, leads us to arguably larger truths. The truth of circumstances that can be cerebral and hypothetical and abstract, and therefore live in our head, or can be physical, physiological, and therefore they live in the space as physiological, physical forces, and they live in our bodies as our physiological, physical reaction to them. So that's why Demidov talks physiology, of course, physicality, physiology. That's why he is actually claiming that our specific imagination, actorly imagination, is physical and physiological. We imagine with our whole being, with our bodies. And of course, physiological is inseparable from emotional, from psychological, which is why, of course, we have that beautiful connection between surrendering to physiological processes, something that may be considered as rough, base, primitive, but it takes us into the heightened emotions, because that's a prerequisite for heightened emotions. And it also takes us into circumstances, because the circumstances are now experienced in a non-cerebral, very concrete way. And of course, relationship, character, circumstances, all of it, environment, all of it has physiological aspects to it, which if they are present, we are in the spectrum of whole truth. And if it's not present, we are in the spectrum of sterile truth, or perhaps hypothetical, intellectual, cerebral truth, which of course is not the whole truth. So that's where I would like to begin. but I also would be very interested in hearing from all three of you, from DeAnna, from Kimon, from Nolan, what does it mean to you, and perhaps in a very practical sense. DeAnna, would you elaborate?
I guess when I think of physiological truth, it seems like, well, according to the book, it's an effortless way into your truth. There's this image of a lemon that comes up. You know, if you only think about a lemon or you imagine a lemon, your mouth kind of just already starts to salivate. It's doing it now. Effortless. So there's an effortlessness around the physiological experience, how we center in this approach, character, circumstances, and what is the third one? I'm sorry.
Relationships.
Yeah, relationships, character, and circumstances. And if we are fully connected to the circumstances and aligned, then the physiological experience just kind of, again, effortlessly presents itself. Demidov talks about in the book, he was working with this one guy who was playing a character in a play. Don't ask me the play. I can't remember.
It's based on Gogol's short story. Nikolai Gogol was a Ukrainian-Russian author, and it's based on his short story. Yes.
Sure.
I think I know where you're heading.
Absolutely. And, you know, this guy was bored with the character, but throughout the process, he was offered all of these different kind of stage directions to kind of like round out his experience. And he has this experience with a pear drink that he kind of just like lives out fully through. And one experience begets another because of the physiological connection that he was able to have to this drink. And so he may have been previously bored, but like with the rounding off of kind of this experience with a drink that he's familiar with, his imagination was able to be so involved that it created one physiological experience after the other. And there was no trying, there was no effort around it. He was able to have a full out truthful experience based off of his connection to this drink that was added through the process. So I don't know, I guess I think of effortless truth when I think of aligning yourself with the physiological experience.
Involuntarity. The actor found the character when Demidov brought his attention onto that pear drink and asked him to truly taste it, to truly go into the details of the experience. He suddenly discovered the whole character. So that's that connection between nitty-gritty physiological and the character. That's a great example, DeAnna. That is actually one of the most powerful moments in the book that talks about physiological experiences. Kimon, what about you? What's your connection? What's your angle?
I'm glad DeAnna reminded me of that story. That's a beautiful story. And one can connect so many things from the book and from the practice with the term, the culture of physiological truth. But one of the first things that at least came to me as I was hearing the term was the freedom to follow that first urge, the freedom to follow that first body experience, the freedom to allow it to happen and take you, to surrender to that first reaction, that first bodily sensation, and then allow it to take you wherever it's supposed to take you without fiddling with it, without interfering whatsoever. And I remember vividly when I first came to experience the Demidovian technique, the Demidovian universe, like you like to call it, Andrei, I remember you saying that the actor's imagination is physical, it's not intellectual. And that has stuck with me since that day and will never, ever, ever change because it makes so much sense. And nobody has said that before. And I come from a different universe before I came in contact with this one, which is Michael Chekhov. And even though Michael Chekhov is kinesthetic, it's not the same. We're not talking about the same thing whatsoever here. It's completely different.
I might want to pick up on what you're saying, Kimon, because DeAnna, when you were talking about that, the story of the pear drink, right? It made me think of, some people have worked in different kind of philosophies where they have this approach that they want the actor to be physically doing something at all times. And I think they kind of confuse this concept that we're talking about, this kind of physical truth, with just like physical activity. And they're not exactly the same thing, right? Experiencing that pear drink that was already there or a part of the story and really experiencing physically all the things that that created in him is different than constantly giving an actor busy work, which to me, in some ways, kind of creates a physical noise that I'm always expected to be moving or doing or cleaning the table or eating the sandwich or whatever. And it doesn't actually allow the text that I've assigned to myself to resonate in me and then create these real physical impulses, which, when followed, are endlessly delightful. You know, as we've been talking about it, I've been thinking about those first couple of weeks of training where you see actors want to stand up and not stand up. And when you invite them to, and then they follow those first physical impulses, the actual real delight that comes from that. And I've seen lots of actors just take physical direction on stage, go, wash that table or hang these clothes, and it does not provide the same delight. And so I guess I wanted to just kind of split that hair because, Kimon, you were starting to do it, because I think it is an important distinction with what we're talking about. Andrei, maybe you can, put a finer point on this than I am.
I absolutely agree with you, Nolan, because Demidov actually says it. The real advantage of physical actions is getting the actor's physiology involved. But the problem is if you don't know how to surrender to your physiological experiences and to greenlight them, and we're talking about imaginary physiological experiences, we will clarify in a moment, then of course, you're right, all of the physical businesses and physical actions, they remain just that. Physical businesses and physical actions, they don't pull you into character. They don't drag you into circumstances. They don't immerse you into the relationship. Because while physiology and surrendering to it is a very powerful device, it is simply missing because the physical actions that do have that power, and probably that's exactly what Stanislavski was trying to do, with actors who are not trained in surrendering to imaginary physiological experiences and greenlighting it, they do nothing. They just basically become a distraction from the fact that the audience is watching. And that's all that they are, right? Give actor one thing to do after another, after another, after another. Before you know it, they're like a baby who has been distracted by a rattle, right? And don't notice the audience because they concentrate on one business, then comes the next business, that comes the next business. If they only surrender to the physiological richness of that experience, they would actually found themselves immersed in character. But why is it that we are talking about imagination here, physical imagination or physiological imagination? Because in the example that DeAnna gave us, the guy, the actor, was not actually drinking a pear drink. There was water, right? But the moment Demidov reminded him how the real drink would actually taste, the stickiness of it, the sweetness of it, the tartness of it, right? The moment he started drinking that and his body responded with physiological imagination to what was actually given, the character was born out of it. So a very important distinction, Nolan, in terms of physical actions versus the Demidovian culture of physiological truth, because physical actions is just scratching the surface, and it's just the distraction from the fact that the audience is watching, baby steps, and physiological truth is something much, much larger. Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about heightened emotions. And why is it that Demidovian physiological imagination is what gives us access to heightened emotions? Because heightened emotions, as psychology in general, they are not sterile. Usually, let's face it, when the playwright or the director is asking you to come up with a certain emotion, you are thinking about grief, ecstasy, thoughtfulness, tenderness, right? Or heightened emotions, despair, for example, or some kind of extreme anger. You're thinking of them and you're trying to evoke them emotionally. Well, it's clear it's not going to work because evoking an emotion is impossible. Emotion is caused by circumstances or relationship or character's life. But what happens is actors are failing also because they are separating that emotion from anything physical and physiological. And yet, can we take a look at heightened emotions? What's happening in you physiologically when you get scared, for example, or when you get hugely ashamed and embarrassed? When you're embarrassed, don't you have blood, actual blood, rushing to your face? When you are scared, don't you have that actual physical, physiological tingly sensation, for example? Or hair stands up on your skull? You know that expression? It's not just an expression, hair stood up on their skull. It's actually happening. And whatever physical, or when you grow pale, right, that means that the blood is now rushing away from your face. You do realize what this is. This is physiological processes, or you break into sweat, right? All of it is physiological. So when actors, be it in Shakespeare, be it elsewhere, are trying to come up with these emotions and they're not trained to surrender to the normal, biological, organic, physiological processes that will always happen, you just need to know how to give into it, then of course emotions don't come. And heightened emotions certainly don't come. Why? Because they are as physiological as they are actually emotional and psychological. And the key is to surrender to the physiology of it, which Demidov trains not only in the etudes, when you are given certain physiological themes in the etudes and texts that evoke physiological reaction, because it's all about the first reaction, of course, which is physiological as much as it is anything else. And you need to know how to green light it. But it's also trained through the scales. And although we are about to enter a slippery slope of scales, because we don't want to introduce them to people who are not established in the process, that can do more harm than good. At the very same time, one of the fundamental scales that I know you're all playing have something to do with physical sensations. Hot, cold, sitting on a wet bench, right? Leaning against a warm wall, or warming your hands next to a furnace, or headache, toothache, fatigue, right? All of it are physiological things, and Demidov teaches you by actually doing your scales how to respond to these themes, to these suggestions, because these are mere suggestions. You actually don't feel anything like that, but how to respond to it physically, physiologically. It's a huge part of training, this physical part of the scales, physiological part of the scales, and it goes a very, very long way.
For those that haven't had the opportunity of doing this work practically, which is, much of what this work is doing it practically. I always kind of want to take a moment to say, when we use this word surrender, the most miraculous thing about the work that I've discovered is that a lot of actors experience this, I got goosebumps, or my hair stood up like you're talking, or I felt, the blood rush to my cheeks for a half a second, for a moment. But then it goes away, and that's when I need to rely on my technique. So I get to my objective or my actions or whatever. And what I kind of want to say to them is that this idea of surrender that we are talking about, it is amazing how by training that ability to surrender to these things, they grow. That as we are experiencing them, they grow and they grow and they become overwhelming. And that kind of growth into something overwhelming is, in some ways, kind of part of the trajectory to those higher planes of emotions, Andrei, that you have spoken about. But yeah, I hope, if you're listening to this and haven't had the chance to experience that, I hope you get to, because it is something really special.
DeAnna, you spoke about involuntarity, right? Involuntariness. How do you experience it as an actor? Because, of course, you've done quite a few very important roles within this school, right? I'm thinking about Olga, for example, in Three Sisters. How do you experience these physiological aspects of the impulses that can pull you and push you when circumstances, relationships actually become physical forces in the space and begin to move you, and not just an abstract idea? It would be very interesting. Can you maybe go to a certain moment in one of your roles, or just some kind of experience generally that you can distill? Because It's an interesting abstract thought. Emotions become physical. Okay, we get it, right? Emotions have the physiological part to it. But what about circumstances, relationships, other characters producing physical impulses upon you when they pull you and push you and move you and so on and so forth? How would you describe that? Or is it just an abstract idea, or is it something that you've experienced in practice? If so, how did you experience it?
My most recent role, I played a midwife whose practice was centered in herbs. And on stage, we had different herbs. And there was a scene where I talked about my mother who passed and how she passed down the practice to me. And it was interesting because on stage, I would have a mortar and pestle and I would be grounding the herbs as I was moving through the scene. And I would hold the mortar and pestle up to my nose and I would smell it. And every time I would smell it, it would kind of just like, it was interesting to be connected to the circumstances of that because the experience was imbued physiologically. The smell of the sage, the smell of the lemon balm, the smell of these herbs kind of brought into my imagination the experience I had watching my mother and her kind of teaching me the way in, how to navigate the herbs when it comes to how I offer them to the women she worked with as a midwife. And it brings a smile to my face now to think of the experience that my character was having with her mother. Of course, none of this I've never actually experienced, but it was being connected with the circumstances that I was able to be physiologically imbued with the experience of it. And so I guess it's interesting to just simply experience it in a concrete way. It wasn't something that I was putting on. It wasn't something that I was
Evoking or trying to
evoking or
manufacture, right?
trying. You know, there was no trying about it. There was a simply living out the truth of it.
What did you actually have inside the cup?
It it didn't smell like it, actually. It was grass. A lot of it was plastic, you know. It was just plastic herbs. It was sometimes there and sometimes not, but smelling it, all of this kind of lifted itself in the space. And I would, I just remember, I remember this. So and we were talking about the scales, hot, cold, someone knocking at the door, being bitten by a mosquito. In the practice of that, it kind of allowed me to be sensitive to the specificity of certain experiences.
Purely imaginary experiences, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely.
DeAnna, what you're reminding us is that on stage, it's never going to be the real thing.
Sure.
That gun is never going to be made out of metal and wood, right? These herbs are never going to smell like herbs. What's going to be in your glass, it's not going to be wine, right? Or beer.
Right.
It's always going to be water or something that has been, made to look a certain color. It's never going to be hot when it's supposed to be hot. It's never going to be cold when it's supposed to be cold. In fact, probably vice versa. And if you don't know how to evoke these sensations, by the way, not through memory, because there are people watching us now, listening to us and saying, yeah, what's new? Emotional recall, sensory memory, right? No, it's not sensory memory. It's not emotional recall. It is physical imagination. DeAnna was imagining the smell and not doing it because she was trying to evoke it, that smell that connected her with her character's mother, right, with the larger circumstances. She wasn't trying to evoke it. She wasn't trying to recall it. That would have taken her out of the moment, right? She, through the use of regular scale work, because scales in Demidov have this physiological training about it, physiological imagination, DeAnna was actually imagining it here and now rather than recalling it from the past experience. So that's, I think, very important distinction.
Well, I was thinking a couple of things, but I was I was following what DeAnna was saying, what you were saying, Andrei. I had a couple of thoughts, and one of them was that I'm always mesmerized when we're having a class and somebody's doing an etude, for instance, on how these physiological truths and these physiological things resonate in the space sometimes. And they literally change the atmosphere between two actors working in the space. For instance, you might literally ask them what time it was, and they will say the same specific time. Or you will ask them if it was dark, and their room is absolutely lit, and it was dark for them. So this transformation, this idea that by allowing the involuntary, by allowing these reflexes, by allowing all these wonderful things and not inhibiting them, not getting in their way, they're carried away by their imagination, and that imagination becomes literally their truth as they're living it in the etude, for instance. And I'm always mesmerized with that. My second thought was the fact that most people equate now the idea of physiological truth, for instance, with the idea I'm going to get in and I'm going to be doing things, and these things are going to be realistically, and I'm just going to be reacting. And usually this thing, and I think Nolan talked about it by talking about physical actions, but these things usually get you to a truthfulness, not to truth. They will get you somewhere that might resemble truth. Usually, at least 99% of the time, I've seen it in classes, they'll get you in what Demidov calls motor storming, where you're banging yourself right and left and not allowing these things to take you where they're supposed to take you, and you're not controlling it, for instance. You're not losing control. We're not talking about anarchy. I'm talking about the idea that you've said before, that the body doesn't have its own agenda, but it wears the soul, right? It's the costume of the soul, and it will go wherever you allow it to go because it's following the circumstances. And that's going to be the truth, not truthfulness.
But the circumstances must be physical, physiological, not cerebral, not even just emotional. And yet, I'm hearing from certain teachers, from certain actors, physiology, no, it's base, it's crude, it doesn't belong to the realm of art, right? Artistic realm should be distilled, should be deprived, should be cleansed of these kind of base things. Let's look at tragedy, classical and contemporary. Why is it that you cannot play tragedy without physiological imagination, without having strong physiological imagination? And that's usually the problem. Actors are striving for heightened emotions that are completely asked for in tragedy, right? You cannot neglect it. You have to go into that heightened realm. And yet they're seeking for the heightened emotion when all they need to master is how to surrender to the physiology of the moment. Why? Because every great playwright is going to make sure that in those moments when you are supposed to be in the heightened realm as an actor, you are supported by physiological impulses. Why? Because that's what actually dissolves the brakes in life. That's what actually dissolves the filters. That's what allows us to be ourselves, to be authentic, to be completely truthful, not truth-like, as Kimon mentioned. Why? Because we don't give a damn anymore. That's why in the most heightened moments, King Lear is going to be sent to the heath when he is battling with the elements. Hamlet is going to get a skull of poor Yorick that has just been dug out of the grave and stinks and has rotten flesh on it. And imagine you're holding in your hands a skull of someone you personally knew. Is it not a physiological experience? So most Hamlets, when they hold that fake thing, right, they say, oh, poor Yorick. Really? Imagine you're holding in your hands a skull of someone you knew personally and loved. Would you be lyrical, poetic, or would something else come out of you? Joan of Arc is going to get a helmet. Katerina in Ostrovsky's The Storm is going to get a key in her hands that is burning her hands because with that key, she can open the gate and go and meet her lover, which is a huge sin in her world. And that's why the key is burning her hand. Every great tragic playwright is going to give you, as a character, something physical and physiological to tackle so that emotions are spurred by it, emotions are instigated by it. And when it comes to contemporary tragedians, the ones who are disguising as realistic playwrights, well, it goes without saying. Think about Strindberg's Miss Julie. She's on her period. She hasn't slept for several nights, because it's that time of the year when the sun is about to set, right? But it doesn't set and it goes up again. So it's never dark, so people don't really sleep. She's just been dancing with these peasants in the barn, all sweaty from the experience. She's going to have beer. She is also carrying a scar. Her fiancé, remember, he lashed her with a whip, so she has a scar on her face that is still probably bleeding, that she's maybe covering with makeup. She is horny, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So needless to say, that's what it takes for a contemporary tragic character to lose their mind and to do reckless things, which is what tragedy is all about. Strindberg calls that play realistic tragedy, or rather naturalistic tragedy. That's how he calls it. Miss Julie is a naturalistic tragedy. But any tragedy is naturalistic in terms that it's going to ask you to imagine real physiology, to embody that physiology, because without that physiology, without being really plastered, really drunk, without having not slept for days and days and days, right? With that kind of adrenaline and that kind of complete melting away of the body, talking about the Demidovian sleep of the body, right? That's what this playwrights are trying to create through physiological means. Exhausted, at the same time excited, right? Pain. There's always going to be pain, because when you're in pain, physical pain, you are speaking your mind, you are speaking your heart, right? That's what they do. But how can an actor who has not been trained in Demidovian physiological truth and surrender to it, how can they meet all that? So they keep trying to find emotions, to find the psychology, to find the relationship, to find the circumstances, and none of it is really present, because all of it is A, hugely physiological, and B, has to be experienced as hugely physiological, but the training is simply not there. So that's one of the reasons why the Demidovian culture of physiological truth is so paramount, but not as an abstract thought, right, but as training, as actual training that we want to follow.
There's something, Andrei, that I think maybe we haven't fully gotten to yet that I just thought of as you were speaking. And I think we've been, in some ways, talking about physiological truth and being careful to distinguish it from Meisner's reality of doing, from these kinds of inane just actions for action's sake, and also from any kind of memory recall or any of those.
Or physical actions, right?
All those kinds of things we're saying. This physiological truth is very separate from those. And one of the things that it yields, perhaps most magically, is that non-analytical transformation. That when I'm working with students on etudes or doing etudes myself, you find a student waking up and saying, well, I just had this tremendous sore in my shoulder. It felt like I couldn't move that arm, right? And that is a physiological thing. But you can't get there with actions. You can't get there with recall, and you can't get there with Meisner's reality of doing. That is complete physiological imagination, and that is so deeply a part of what we do. And that, I feel like, is not just something that is separate from those other techniques or thought processes. They don't have anything that even approximates that. In fact, I always remember in certain books I read saying, don't worry, that's not possible, so we're just not going to talk about it. When in fact, it very much is possible. So would you talk a little bit, maybe, Andrei, about how that leads to character, how that kind of physiological experience is a part of, that just born character we sometimes talk about?
Well, first and foremost, I want to back you up. It is possible. It is very possible. Why? Because our body, especially if you're an actor, has that capacity to imagine not only circumstances or some environment, but physiological experiences. It can imagine physiological experiences that will become real. And God knows it's always going to be connected with circumstances, because circumstances are going to be physiological, the skull, for example, and it's going to be connected with relationship, because don't we experience each other physiologically? Don't we have physiological reactions to each other? And it's going to be, of course, connected with environment, which, as we previously mentioned, is never going to be in the theater what it's supposed to be according to the play. So you have to imagine it. Imagine it how? In your mind? If you imagine it in your mind, it was just going to take you out of the space, out of your communion with the partner, out of here and now, the most important thing. You have to imagine it with your body. And so when it comes to that imagination, how is it connected to character and transformation, I think is what you want us to talk about, Nolan, right? Well, needless to say, since you mentioned just born character, which is not to be mistaken with some kind of an idea of character, dogma of character, your beloved character, because God knows each and every one of us has a character we could play in our sleep, right? Wake me up in the middle of the night, I can play Andrei Malaev-Babel very convincingly. Why? Because I've been playing Andrei Malaev-Babel for how many years, right? And so it's very easy for us to play that person that we've rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. But what's true is that having read the play, we conceive the embryo of the character. That embryo is unique. That character is unique. They're not us, really, right? They're not our beloved persona. They are not what other actors played in that role, right? They're really a unique creation that is conceived by us from the playwright, so to speak, from what we've just read, and it comes in all shapes and forms. And one of the things that you're going to experience very often, physiological sensations. So when you're beginning to play that character, when you're rehearsing, when you are facilitating the character at home, when physiological sensations come, you certainly want to surrender to them without any questions, because they will lead you to that inimitable character. And very often it comes through physiological experiences and sensations, which if you discard them because you're going to say, wait a second, what does it have to do with my character? That's not who my character is. That's not what I'm supposed to feel now. That's not what I'm supposed to experience. You just killed the embryo, or at least you stopped the development of the embryo. You just went with something that is your idea. Why is surrendering to physiological sensations safe? Because, as you mentioned, Nolan, it doesn't come from the head. It doesn't come from the cerebral idea about who my character is. It comes from my intuition, from my instinct, from my subconscious, from the unique embryo of that just born character. It comes from reliable source, because your head can do construction of character, plotting, conceptual thing, right? It can be influenced by what I know about the character from actors who played it before, what kind of dogmatic idea I may have formed in my head. That's what the head is capable of doing, of misjudging. But what's coming from me that is physiological, it's safe to trust it. Everything physiological, you can safely trust. Why? Because it's not cerebral, because it's not coming from your head, right? Because it's coming from the body, from the psyche, from your whole being. So it's one of the most reliable aspects of character facilitation and character development, Nolan, from that perspective, because it's non-cerebral and it cannot lead you into the intellectual realm. It always comes from the mighty subconscious. I am hoping that's what you wanted to hear and that's what you meant, but maybe there are other angles. DeAnna, Kimon, what other angles do you have on this physiology and character, or physiology and circumstances?
Honestly, I think you covered it quite well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kimon, any new thoughts?
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Then I will suggest one thing. right? Everybody's listening to us and saying, well, of course, they're saying Demidov is the best, Demidov is the strongest, Demidov has something nobody else has. Well, I will suggest that this emphasis on physiology that is missing everywhere else has everything to do with his training. He's a professionally trained psychiatrist, medical doctor, and actually physiologist as well, and biologist. He actually practiced as a medical doctor for almost 10 years until Stanislavski said, listen, you must dedicate yourself fully to theater. So he is bringing this aspect into the work that nobody else could bring because of his training. A graduate of the Moscow University of all places, with a degree in psychiatry and psychology, but also medical doctor for almost a decade, practicing, very popular and effective medical doctor. So that's where it's coming from. He knows how human beings function. He knows how we operate. He knows our not only psychology, but our physiology, and he knows that they are completely inseparable. We will have actually an opportunity for everybody who is listening to practice. We have a summer course coming, right, which is in London. And so if you are in London or would like to come to London, it will be dedicated to the culture of freedom, the chief Demidovian culture. And it will happen in the heart of London, 22nd to the 27th of June, but it will be preceded by 2 online intensives. So rather, it's one intensive, part 1 and part 2. So part 2 of the summer intensive that will take place from June 8th to 12th will be dedicated to the Demidovian culture of physiological truth in practice. So if you want to put some practice to that theory, please sign up. We would love to share it with you as a practical training, not just ideas, right? Because as practical as we are trying to be here and as concrete, as precise, of course, in a podcast form, it will always sound a bit theoretic.
Yes. And Andrei, as well, are we currently recruiting for the next 2-year training course, or am I speaking too soon?
You're not speaking too soon. We've just announced that the recruitment is open for the 2026-2028 Demidov Acting Certificate course, which is a wonderful and only opportunity to immerse yourself in the complete Demidov curriculum 3 times per week, 2.5 hours per day, under my guidance and the guidance of people like you, and not only people like you, but actually your guidance as certified teachers. And there is no other program like that. It actually is a 2-year comprehensive Demidovian curriculum. Frankly, what I did is I took his 4-year curriculum, and in order to make it possible for actors to go through, I reduced it to 4 semesters, which is why it's 2 years. And it's a transformative experience. And if you are truly interested in practicing and making the Demidov School of Acting your default, your creative default, then that is the only program that exists that can actually do it. So yes, Nolan, thank you for the reminder. We do now recruit for it, and the first candidates have been having their first interview with me, which is how it all begins. We talk, we want to determine whether this is the right program for you, so it all starts with an interview that I conduct with the prospective participants.
Well, let's leave it there for today, and more to follow on our next episode. For those who are listening, all the details for all those workshops and classes are going to be included below for you to find, and you can find more information about any of us on the website as well, which will be linked below. So thank you all so much for joining us, and those who are listening, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you very much. See you later.
Thank you.